gives us great pleasure to welcome and introduce Father Claude Mostowik, MSc, to our seminar. And Claude is a most incredible person. Currently, he is the director of the MSc Social Justice Office. If you're not on his mailing list, then I'd recommend it. The most wonderful little gems come out that almost always there's something in Claude's daily mail out that I file somewhere and hope that I can find it again when I want it. Claude was trained in theology in Melbourne and in psychology in Rome. He lived in Rome for 4 years. He worked in the Northern Territory for 5 years. I think he still is, I'm not sure if this is correct, you've had your national meeting. Are you still the national president of Pax Christi? I thought you might be. Claude is currently newly elected for how many terms? A second term?
What's that?
Pax Christi.
I've only had the one term. This is having elections in 2 weeks' time,
Right.
so...
I knew they were coming.
Yeah.
Claude is national president of Pax Christi. He works at the Edmund Rice Centre. In particular, he works for Pacific Calling. He edits Just Comment, and if you don't receive Just Comment, again, I'd really recommend that as a publication. Excellent material. He is an advocate for justice. He works for the Community Justice Coalition, among other things. And so Claude's topic today is engaging compassionately with the world. He comes with a lifetime of lived experience in the topic that he's going to speak to us on. So Claude, we welcome you.
Thank you.
Thought I was going to run out of time. My talk. I always run out of time anyway, but thank you for the welcome. And I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Great Heyward Nation, and also to do that, we also acknowledge the wrongs that have been done to them by newcomers to this land, and we seek to be partners with them in righting these wrongs and living together in peace and harmony. I'd just like to begin with a couple of little quotes, or 2 or 3 quotes, and they'll probably be on the screen in a minute. The first one is just quotes, and I just sort of throw them out there, not necessarily to talk about them, but they sort of somehow capture some of the ideas that I'd like to touch on in this talk. And the talk I never finish, so because I keep adding to it and changing things and so on. But if you want to have a copy of it, I'm quite happy to have a copy of the talk afterwards. Okay, so the first one is we touch this strength, our power, who we are in the world, when we are most fully in touch with one another and with the world. And we are participants in ongoing incarnation, bringing God to life in the world. The quotes come from Carter Heyward. She's a black American Episcopalian priest, woman priest. Okay, so she's wrote this some years ago. She's been a very passionate writer about justice and so on, and also in terms of gender and so on. The next quote is, "Love, like truth and beauty, is concrete. It's not a sweet feeling, it's a matter or a sentiment, but something active, effective, a matter of making reciprocal and mutually beneficial relationships with one's friends and enemies. And to make love is to make justice. As advocates and activists for justice know, loving involves struggle, resistance and risk. And working on behalf of women, blacks, lesbians and gay men, the ageing, the poor in this country and elsewhere, know that making justice is not a warm and fuzzy experience." And then she goes on, "Love is a conversion to humanity, a willingness to participate with others in the healing of a broken world and broken lives." There's more than that verse, one to read it all. And so they're just, I think, some of those quotes somehow just capture for me some of the ideas that I would like to just explore in this presentation. One of the words that's important for us in our faith is the word Eucharist. And part of the Eucharist is the word remembering. And the opposite to that word is the word forgetting. The heart of Christian resistance to injustice is the Eucharist. It helps us to undo this imagination where torture is a ritual drama that enables us to create the enemies we think we need. Christ's action in the Eucharist and also in his life and the sacrifice is one that overcomes distinctions between what we call friend and enemy. We've been made friends of God through Christ's sacrificial action, and a true understanding of this term sacrifice is one that's based on love, not on wrath or on violence. And the resurrection shows that it is God who has sided with the victims. Matthew 25, the Gospel, that one that talks about the sheep and the goats. Always feel sorry for the goats in this one, but makes clear that Jesus radically identifies with the people who are the least in the world. Christ doesn't just identify with those of us who might be ministers towards those who are hungry or imprisoned or tortured in any way, but Christ radically identifies with those who are tortured and imprisoned and who are hungry. So as the body of Christ, we too are called not only to minister to the victims, but to somehow identify with them. We sometimes call that in terms of solidarity. So to identify with them. And this overcomes that opposition that sometimes we can have at least in our minds, if not in our actions and our behaviour, of friend and enemy. The Eucharist becomes for us the sacrament of non-violence. And thinking of, excuse me, last, was it Wednesday? Tuesday's Feast of the Transfiguration, or the feast of the memorial of Hiroshima, bombing of Hiroshima, and today is the anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. Sister Joan Chittister, in one of her books, speaks what to do to what we do today in terms of those memorials, what we do to the body of Christ. And she says, war is a depredation of the human spirit that is sold as the loftiest of livelihoods. In other words, it's always built up and glorified. To hide the rape and the pillage, the degradation and disaster, the training of human beings to become animals in ways we would allow no animals to be, we have concocted a language of mystification. Then she goes on in terms of talking about collateral damage, the millions of civilians we're prepared to lose in war, especially in nuclear war, and still call ourselves winners. We call the deadliest weapons in the history of humankind the most benign of names. And those benign names are like, little boy, call them Bambi, peacemakers and so on. We give them benign names and yet they are, and sometimes even these destroyers and submarines, we've called them Corpus Christi and so on. And then she often goes on to say that we take smooth-faced young men out of their mothers' kitchens to teach them how to march blindly into death, how to destroy what they do not know, how to hate what they have not seen. We make victims of the victors themselves. We call the psychological maiming, the physical squandering, the spiritual distortion of the nation's most vulnerable defenders, defence. We turn their parents and sweethearts and children into the aged, the widowed and orphaned before their time. So, getting back to, I think that's a bit of a context in terms of the non-violence of the Eucharist, and I think she's speaking to that as well. But one word that's often used also in terms of the Eucharist, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier, is the word anamnesis. And it's connected with what I said before, the word remembering, anamnesis and remembering. The opposite, of course, the Greek opposite of that is amnesia. It's about forgetting. Anamnesis is about unforgetting. It's about remembering. And it concerns, I think, the temptation we have to forget the victims of this world. You might blame them for their situation, their poverty. We might say it's the situation necessary for the free market to function smoothly. And part of this unforgetting is that the friend-enemy dynamic makes martyrs of the victims on our side and ignores the victims of our own violence. Look how we remember the victims of the 9/11 attacks in New York, but we don't remember or even count the numbers of Iraqi or Afghan or Pakistani civilians who have been killed as a result of that. So the enemy becomes dehumanised. I've just read a book by Henry Reynolds, as an Australian historian. He's written quite a number of books relating to Indigenous history and so on. And the book, this last book that he's written, is called Forgotten Wars. And he asks the question, or actually he asks a number of questions, but explores the myth that we have in this country, that our relationship with the Aboriginal people in this land was basically benign. That it was, there were a few skirmishes around the country, but it was basically benign. In fact, it goes through the original sources of the time and so on to show it was nothing of the kind. But there were wars of resistance and defence of the land all over this country, in Tasmania and the rest of this country. And he was sort of saying that basically, and some people at the time, even journalists at the time, were saying, where are the memorials to the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people who were killed? The thing they were doing, what we give people medals for in this country, and he was also saying that how quickly Australia has gone to war overseas, and often saying, please, 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 can we come? Apart from the Second World War, all the other wars that we have participated in, whether it was the Boer War, the war in Sudan, the war in the First World War, Korea, Malaysia, but basically we did not have to be there. As I say, apart from the Second World War possibly. And he's sort of saying that he's looking at this mentality, and this is this mystification that Joan Chittister was talking about earlier, and glorification of war. And we're coming back to that again with the centenary of Anzac Day. And Anzac Day was actually commemorated initially as a way of overcoming war, stop war, and not to make it to mystify it, but to demystify it. And so, so this anamnesis is about remembering the other, remembering that we all connect and belong to one another. The German theologian Johann Baptist Metz speaks of Christ's passion, death and resurrection as a dangerous memory. Some of you may have seen there's a book by Dermot O'Murku who talks about Christianity's dangerous memory. And again, this dangerous memory is about disrupting the world's forgetfulness, or the forgetfulness of the forgotten. And Jesus, as I said before, declared himself to be on the side of the invisible, the oppressed and the exploited, and thus proclaimed the coming dominion of God as something liberating, the liberating power of unconditional love. And the core of our Christian belief, as I believe we know, is that God loved us first. That every article of our Christian faith and every theological statement is basically a footnote to that central belief. Our hearts are a response to a lover whose gaze and call has created us, has named us, and compels response. And if we're looking at the heart of Christ, the spirituality of the heart, sorry I keep going off the text here, But if we go up, the heart of Christ is really, and that sort of represents God's heart, in terms of our own spirituality. And the thing is that this heart is what actually, if you want to call it, labels us. That according to God's heart, there's no such thing again as people with labels. Whether it's Jew or Gentile, male or female, pagan or non-pagan, if you like, gay or straight, and those sorts of things. Or we can even talk about Australian and boat person. But in Christ's heart, we are all, there are no distinctions. That we all become one. That there is no such thing as them and us. It's about us being friends. And again, when Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends, he's actually renaming us. He's actually saying to us, this is the level of our relationship. It's about friends. And the implication is that we take that on as an action, as a mission, if you like, in our lives as well. After the Sunday after the resurrection, after the Easter, we have the gospel of Jesus appearing to the disciples in the upper room, if you remember that one. And it shows Jesus coming, showing the disciples his wounds. And there's that, I'm not going to go into everything I've got here, but in that gospel passage, the disciples are huddled in fear in that wound, if you remember. And the next time Jesus appears in that room again, we have Thomas there. We call Thomas the Doubting Thomas. And I really think that's a really misapplied title, because I think he's always doing us a service by questioning the reality. And the thing is, how could Thomas believe that Jesus is risen? Whilst these disciples were locked up in fear in that room. They say he's risen, we've seen him. But how can you believe that when they're locked up in fear? And then that's when he says, unless I touch the wounds, unless I put my finger where the nails have been on my hand, where the spear has been in his side, then I won't believe. Because he's really saying something about how, because he was out in the streets. He wasn't living in fear. He was out in the streets. And he came and this Jesus was risen. And he finds that this is the way in which we connect with the wounded Christ in our world. It's by having the vulnerability, the courage, if you like, the heart and so on, to touch the wounds of the other, to close the gaps that exist. And it's in closing those gaps, that we somehow touch the face of Christ, if you like, or the heart of Christ in it. And there's that important dimension, I think, the dimension of vulnerability. And continuing on from that, the story of Jesus in that upper room, the resurrection continues I'm on page 4 here. Yeah. Continues in the command to go to Galilee. And I think that's an also important part of the nature of this God that we follow. That the birthplace of the new and the reconciled community is Galilee. Like everything in the Bible, the choice is very significant. As the Latin American theologian Virgilio Elizondo says, Galilee was the outer region, far from the centre of Judaism in Jerusalem, and it was the crossroads of the great caravan routes of the world. It was a region of mixed peoples and languages. And the Jews looked down on the Galileans because they considered them ignorant of the law, the rules of the temple, and were contaminating because of their daily contacts with the pagans. How could God's word be revealed among the impure people of the borderlands. And he goes on to say, God has chosen to become a Galilean underscores the great paradox of the incarnation, in which God becomes the despised and lowly of the world. In becoming a Galilean, God becomes the fool of the world for the world's salvation. Now, Jesus doesn't do away with borders or demand that they be eliminated. But somehow he transforms them from instruments of exclusion and division to places of revelation. It's always at these borderland places somehow something of God's heart and God's revelation appears. Just think about the time of the Syrophoenician woman. You know, the woman who wants Jesus to touch her daughter, to heal her daughter. You know, the man with, you know, loaded up with the pigs, you know. All those stories, but they're always, it's in those sorts of places that somehow that God's revelation and God's heart is most revealed. The other aspect, going back to dangerous memory, the dangerous memory of the anamnesis, of that unforgetting or the remembering, means that things are not the way that things have to be. And the scriptures keep telling us that. I think Jesus is revealing that too. And that's the source of hope for us. To take part in this remembering is to live inside God's imagination, where not even, as we hear in the scriptures, not even a sparrow is forgotten, or a hair of one's head is not counted. So the Eucharist is not just about seeing the world in a certain way, but about acting differently. In the early church, that anamnesis was not just a calling to mind, it wasn't just about remembering, but also a remembering, a putting together, a healing, a reconciling of people. And that's where I think it's such a sacrilege when sometimes the Eucharist can be used to divide people. Who's in and who's out. Who's acceptable and who's not acceptable, you know? It's about a remembering, putting together again. And so the distance between friend and enemy are overcome in the Eucharist, but also in the shared pain. Our solidarity, concrete solidarity, should be with the victims of all nations, and the tortured and the disappeared, and the victims of the bomb attacks that we people with bombs in backpacks and so on, and bombs dropped from sophisticated aircraft, and more becoming with those drones which someone plays at a computer somewhere in the United States to drop bombs on people, helpless people, vulnerable people in Pakistan and Yemen and Afghanistan and so on. So if we live inside God's imagination, we'll see that even the people we most demonise as enemies are made in the image of God. They have something also to teach us about ourselves. And peace doesn't come by torturing and bombing people into democracy. We've been making terrorists faster than we can kill them. And it's only by addressing the underlying causes of that terrorism that peace is honestly possible. And you know, the thing is, we've heard so often, and I've heard it also in meetings overseas and so on, that the world changed on September 11, 2001. But it changed for some people in one small part of the world. Nothing changed for many people in other parts of the world. In Latin America, in Asia or Africa and so on. Where the number of people that died in those attacks in New York, the same number of people die every day of HIV/AIDS in Africa. The same number died every day. And we forget that, you know, that same number of people died in the coup in Chile, you know, in 1975 it was. And so the media keeps filling us with that deafening clamour of war. But we need to look at war in a different way as well. Because I've just got a bit of a list here that I just wanted to sort of say, don't we call it war when young people are assaulted and at times killed by unruly police. I just heard of a young 17-year-old who was shot in Miami who was putting graffiti on the wall. He's actually an acclaimed artist and poet, a 17-year-old young man, you know, unarmed and everything. Don't we call it war when young people are increasingly marginalised from training and ability to find secure work? Don't we call it war when Indigenous people stand up for their rights and dissent discriminatory treatment, and they're confronted by a system that doesn't listen, or when their health gap is not able to be closed? Don't we call it war when women, Muslims, gay people are branded as troublemakers? Don't we call it war when people with a disability do not have full access to services and venues and railway stations and use of public transport? Don't we call it war when women are denied education, especially in Pakistan and places like that? Don't we call it war when women are walking along any dark street, find their anxiety arise or rate increase as she hears footsteps or heavy breathing behind her? Don't we call it war when chainsaws clear forests or assault sacred lands for the sake of coal and national interest? Don't we call it war when mountains lose their tops because of the minerals beneath them? Don't we call it war when animals are abused in their chicken pens and pig pens and forests and jungles and oceans? I just wanted to, I'm just added this because I think we've got to see the threats to our world, not just in terms of the conflict between the military, but as a whole military-industrial complex that's at war with our planet. And I think we're destroying the world not because we're clumsy, we're destroying it because we are very much at war with it, says Stanley Quinn. The dominant culture, he says, is the mode, which is the mode of social and political organisation, or civilization, is killing our planet. Whether it's the large fish, 90% of them dead, 97% of our native forests, 98% of our native grasslands and so on. We're all destroyed. And that's not just because of some clumsy plots, but because of some war against the planet. Derek Jensen poses two riddles for us. And he says, what do you get when you cross a drug habit, a quick temper and a gun? And he says, a long time in prison for murder. And he says, what do you get when you cross two nation states, a large corporation, 40 tons of poison, and at least 8,000 dead human beings? A retirement with full pay and benefits, as did the CEO of Union Carbide, which caused that terrible tragedy in Bhopal in India. So the question is, will we challenge the economic and social system that's at war with this planet? And that economic and social system is the military-industrial complex, which we don't often think about. And the thing is, do we want to feel comfortable or feel better, or do we want to feel effective? And the thing is, we tweak at the edges. We buy hybrid cars, we recycle, we optimistically rely on renewable energy. They're really not enough, because none of that's renewable. So we need to open our eyes and see the world more clearly, to see that the injustice that's occurring, and once aware, to recognise that we have a responsibility to act. And then in line with that, I'll go back to what I said earlier about the glorification of the military. As people identify with the state and its spectacular violence, and advertises the consequences of fighting back. In spite of feminist advances, civilization is still patriarchal and exalts masculinity. Systematically oppresses women and Indigenous people as it celebrates masculine expressions of power and violence. I'm coming back. I just want to keep thinking about the spirituality of the heart in this too. because I just, they might be talking about something right away from it. And I don't shy away from the fact that the spirituality of the heart is something that's very political. It's more about us and how we respond in our world than what God is doing. Because we do represent God, we do, in some way identify with God's heart and the heart of Jesus. But it's not about something out there, but it's about us. It's about how we look at our world and how we respond to it. And the macho, masculine, patriarchal approaches have certainly run contrary to that spirituality. There's an interlocking nature of injustice, and we've got to look at that, and I think I've probably mentioned that in some ways already. There's an intersection of class and race and gender. The United Nations report in 2005 is called The Inequality Predicament, stressed, ignoring inequality in the pursuit of development is perilous. Focusing exclusively on economic growth and income generation as a development strategy is ineffective, as it leads to the accumulation of wealth by a few and deepens the poverty of many. Such an approach does not acknowledge the intergenerational transmission of poverty. So often we hear about, even in political circles, with the election coming up, about growth. How much more growth can we sustain? What are we talking about? It's, we're just, damaging not just the planet, but it's actually, we're looking at, providing or accumulating more for a small section of our community and leaving the larger section behind. And it's interesting that the last few weeks, the Gospels, the Scriptures, for those who might have been following it, have just been speaking so clearly to our situation in Australia. Just if I run through just just try to remember the Gospel of the Good Samaritan we had, just a few weeks ago. Then we had the Gospel of Martha and Mary. In both of those, it's about going beyond the borders, going to hospitality, welcoming the stranger, taking care of the other, especially the enemy. Those sorts of things. Then we have the first reading from Genesis a couple of weeks ago, where Abraham and Sarah welcomed the strangers in the desert, and finding the angels and the promises that come by being open to the stranger and receiving the gifts of the stranger, which they call them the angels and so on. Last Sunday, we had the gospel of the man who was hoarding everything in his barns. I think they're all connected. The whole tone of that gospel was this person was not related, not connected to anyone. What am I going to do? What was my stuff? All my stuff and my stuff. What have we been saying to the asylum seekers coming to this country? This is our country. We're keeping it for ourselves. You're not taking our jobs. We're not going to share anything we've got with you. You can go to buggery. This is what the gospel is, I think, saying to us again and again. This coming Sunday again about where it's very communist, talking about selling our possessions, selling, getting rid of them. But really, it's coming back to saying that God has given us everything that we need. It's about sharing. That's where our identity and our whole person, our humanity, is connected with. And so, limitless growth threatens the planet and people. And we could say that it's really like a weapon of mass destruction. The environment, the poor, the indigenous people. We just look at places, in Indonesia with the palm oil, in Papua New Guinea, West Papua, the mining and all those things. All that is happening. Sacred grounds has been lost, and the damage that's done to the environment, to the native species, and all that sort of stuff for the sake of profit. A lot of that's in our shopping trolley. Palm oil especially. But all these other it's all in our shopping trolley. We can do something about it. This is where it's calling us to think differently and act differently. So, just want to a little bit here, and I'll run ahead because I'm running very late. Our challenge is to seek to listen. And I'll come back to this listening a bit later on. Listen to the stories of struggle to defend the earth and people's rights to land and water and forests and seeds and biodiversity. It's calling for a paradigm shift. We need also, and I'm saying this in terms of also the Pax Christi National Conference that's coming up this in 2 weeks' time today, where in my report to I'm also the New South Wales convener of Pax Christi as well as the national president. And the AGM a couple of months ago, I said that we really need a new spirituality of peace as well. It's not just about the wars and conflicts that we're talking about, because they're very real. But in this country, we need a different kind of spirituality as well, because it's about our engagement with Asia Pacific. It's how we look at our environment. And this paradigm shift must begin with the recognition that we are part of nature, that we are all connected, that we're not its masters, that we don't own it, that we must see ourselves as members of the Earth family, with the responsibility of caring for other species and life on Earth in all its diversity. It creates the imperative to live, produce and consume within ecological limits and with our share of ecological space, without encroaching on the rights of other species and peoples. We need to go beyond the popular but artificial false categories promised by those in politics who speak of perpetual growth or economic growth, who speak of fair trade or free trade, not fair trade, consumerism and competitiveness. To have peace, we need to develop a consciousness of the rights of the earth, of our duties towards earth, our compassion for all beings on the earth. It's interesting, we can have so much to learn from indigenous people, and Evo Morales, who Americans love to hate, is the president of Bolivia, who's an indigenous Indian president, I think it's in their constitution, about the rights of the species. They've gone right back into not just about human rights, but the rights of animals and the earth. And just recently, some people who were living in that country, actually I think they were Americans that actually moved there some years ago, their land had been threatened and also some of the land had been devastated by mining companies, and actually took them to court and won. Not because it was their property, but the rights of the land had been violated. So these people who owned that land didn't get any compensation, but it was recognised in law, and these companies had to make reparations. So it's just I think they've got so much to teach us. To have peace, we need to develop the consciousness of the rights of the earth, of our duties towards earth, our compassion for all beings on the earth. It means challenging, I won't go into it again, but I've said it, about challenging the capitalist patriarchy of which capital, corporations and growth are founded. Now, to get back on track again, page 11. When we're talking about injustice and violence, I think at the heart of it, of that injustice and violence, is a lie. And the lie is that those that we might ignore or neglect or accuse or condemn or kill are not like us. It's going back to that spirituality of peace I was just referring to in a sense. But that there's a lie at the heart of injustice, that the other is not like me. We forget that we share with those we treat harshly or even a common humanity. It's about forgetting the humanity of the other. I was just reading a book called Voices of War. Various people have had, wrote poetry and experiences of war and so on. And this man who'd been to Iraq as a Marine, and he was talking about how he had once frightened the life out of a family who were driving in their car, and they pointed the guns at them and this sort of thing. And the man had his family in the car, and they were waving to them and terrified and everything else. And he was reminiscing about that with some of his friends and how they thought it was a great joke and laughed and, you know, having beers and everything else. You know, frightened the shit out of this poor, excuse my language, about these Iraqis. And then when he got home, he was telling his wife and some cousins and that, you know, how this, you know, thought this was a great little story. And they all thought it was not a good story. They thought it was terrible. They thought it was nothing to laugh at or joke about. And then that's what caused him then to question, you know, his own attitudes to war, his own attitudes towards the Iraqis. He's got to join the peace movement. And so it's just those sorts of, you know, the challenges. And it takes guts, you know, it takes real courage to do that. You know, we don't, you know, it happens even, you know, we can have racist jokes and things like that in a classroom, or not a classroom, in a staff room or something like that, or in the playground, or in the workplace, and other places. But it takes real courage to really say to someone, look, that's not appropriate. You know, I don't want to hear that, you know. There's someone who keeps sending me emails about really negative, awful stuff about asylum seekers and refugees, you know. And again this morning, you know, oftentimes I'll just ignore them, and every so often I'll just come back at him, you know. Otherwise I'll just get all defensive. But the thing is, you really need to do that if you're going to make an impact of change and social transformation in our world. There's another story of this Ku Klux Klan man, and he was telling this. He was on one of that Andrew Denton show some years ago on ABC, and he was telling how, you know, he was there were the works that did, the fires they did, and, you know, abused black people and so on. And there's this one particular minister of religion that they were always targeting. And one day they came into a restaurant, you know, and this minister of religion was having some dinner with food, you know, and they came in and they said to him, "We're going to do to you what you'll do to that chicken," you know. And he didn't say anything. He just picked up the plate with the chicken and kissed it. Now that caused this young man to completely change his attitude. You know, I don't know what happened to his friends, but they left the restaurant. You know, and he's become a sort of another person who's working for sort of social harmony, at least. You know? And I think he's also become a minister himself. You know, it's those sorts of little, you know, prophetic little actions that can make change. You know, and it's really, I think, just a vote for humanity. You know? I didn't say at the start, if you have a question or want to say something, please feel free to butt in, okay? So please don't hesitate, okay? For clarification. Just in terms of this lie that I was talking about, you know, that the other doesn't share our common humanity. George Bernard Shaw has this quote and says, "The worst sin towards our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but to be indifferent to them." That's the essence of humanity. It's, you know, to convince ourselves that these people are not like us, so they can be demonised. So as we move on, you know, that happened. You know, that demonisation has happened so many times, and we, you know, just through the whole history. You know, that's the demonisation. The other is not like me. That would allow things like the Holocaust to happen, Crusades. You know, the neglect of people living with HIV/AIDS in various parts of Africa and Asia and so on. It's allowed us to watch on as the ethnic cleansing happened in the Balkans. It's homophobia and all those sorts of things, and abuse of other people's. So we need to engage with our world, and as we do that, we need to always ask ourselves, who's missing? Who is missing for whatever reason? Who's not fitting in? The Gospels, Catholic social teaching, and the spirituality of the heart are always directing us, I think, to that question. Because failure here diminishes our voice on the religious landscape. And we cease to be a voice for peace and justice and love. And I think very much at the present moment with the asylum seekers, I might have a bit of an obsession with it. I don't think I do. I think it's just something very real at the moment, is that we seem to have the people that we least expect to speak out doing it. Journalists, editors, people who have no faith, who do seem to do most of the really humane critiques and challenges to the government and the opposition and their policies on that issue. And yet the people that we would expect to speak out hardly speak out. Has anyone heard George Pell say anything about it? The only person and amongst the Catholic bishops is Bishop Hannah. Now he spoke once. I consider that not enough, because we need to do it over and over again. The United Church has been quite strong on this issue. So our voice on the religious landscape is being diminished by our silence, and it's a silence that kills. As Alison said, I work at the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education. I have do some work with the Pacific Calling Partnership and the Eco Justice Desk, but my main work there is to do the publications and research, the just comments that she mentioned, and they're on the website if you want to, free to take down and print off and that sort of thing. But we have this little working mission statement, and it says the needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. The freedom of the weak takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. And the access of marginalised people in society and the marginalised earth itself takes priority over the preservation of an order that excludes them. I think it somehow summarises something of the vision of God's heart provided by Jesus and by the prophets. And compassionate and just engagement means that we're called into, as I said, relationship with one another. It's that connection with one another, to see that we are part of one another and a part of the earth that we're connected with. It demands that we listen, welcome and engage with those who are different to us. And though this broken world needs our justice work, it also needs our love, our rage, our heart, our humanity, and our justice work. So in any authentic commitment to social justice, we start by listening always to the personal stories and experiences of others. Otherwise we become oppressors again. And we come and saying, we know what you need. We've had that all over in the Northern Territory division. I know that there's a lot of division amongst the Aboriginal people about the intervention, but it wasn't a lot of engagement. There wasn't a lot of dialogue about that. We know what you need. And we know what you unemployed people need too. We know what you disabled people need as well. And this sort of stuff. We don't listen to their stories. And Father Dan Hartnett, who's a US Jesuit who worked in Lima for many years, says, in the area of justice, the turn to experience has a specific meaning. It suggests that a commitment to justice does not begin with abstract concepts, as important as they may be, but with attention to concrete experiences of social suffering. In other words, we take the first step in the direction of justice by shifting our attention from ourselves and by focusing on the daily experiences of those who suffer injustice. It begins with the effort to put ourselves in the shoes of the other, especially those in extreme poverty or who are enduring painful forms of social exclusion. Without that direct contact with everyday suffering, without sustained attention to real histories of pain, justice will never become something someone truly cares about, or something someone constitutes as a real priority. Mark Peel, the he's a young social researcher from Melbourne, and beautiful young man. And he has done some studies of Western Sydney. And in this, just a little quote here, he says, "The people in the present to whom we need to listen are those who have already lost the most, who have paid a price and blasted hopes and dreams for the comforts of others. We need to listen not out of sympathy or compassion, but because they have much to tell us. Losers know things about the world that winners don't. There are things that being privileged doesn't teach you. And from the lowest rung, you see things that aren't visible from the top or the centre. If the shape of society looks justified, natural, and commonsensical to those who are born elevated or elevated to its leadership, how much more important are the perspectives of those deemed suitable only to be led. The unlucky know more about the world and its vulnerabilities than the lucky, and the weak have a far better sense of that than the strong." And we find that over and over again, with the contact we have with people who have been in prison, people out of prison, people who have, have mental illness, living on the street, homeless people, Indigenous people, and sometimes they can be as self-centred as anything, and yet they still have something of real truth to teach us. And sometimes that self-centeredness comes out of a self-preservation, and we can blame them for that, or we do tend to blame them for that, and that's all we see. But we fail to understand that they have so much that they can teach us about humanity and about our humanity. Sister Anne Jordan from the Cana community, and I say Master occasionally, speaks of the homelessness in the body. And she says people in Australia don't usually die for lack of shelter or food, but they do because of loneliness. She tells the story of this transsexual woman who I met a number of times who was homeless but didn't want a room at the centre because she said someone else might need it more. All that she wanted was able to stay on the porch in the back there, the back of the house, whenever the police tried to move her on. We find that so often. There's in the midst of their own seeking what they can get and so on. As I said, often out of this sort of self-preservation, there's also that real sensitivity and care for others and concern about others. Someone else might need it more than me. And the mission of the Cana community is always, as Sister Anne Jordan says, it's about being there with people, for people and with people, more importantly, with the least options. I've known them to take people who no one else would take because they might have been child abuse or sex, that sort of thing. And people that most of us might revile from, and yet that means we take those with the least options that no one else will have. I did ask earlier who's missing and who's missing from our radar. I might just have a little bit of a pause. Is that okay? I've been going hell for leather. Sorry about that. Just think about who are some of those people in our circle that we might not consider as who might be missing from our radar. Who are the winners and losers in our world? Would someone like to just throw up a few little groups of people that you think are winners or losers basically? Sorry, Bob.
I mean, it's a very big problem, especially in developing countries, this social issue problem.
Yep.
I mean, like in a country like our country, a place like my place which is exploited for gold, you really feel that the weak don't have a voice.
No.
Recently, when I was on holidays, just before coming here, this cyanide spill in the sea and fish wall, and that's how we live. People from the island, that's where we get things, fish and the company was all covering it up that it is fish phoning and all these things. And people, simple people were trying to speak, and the government was also covering this because of money. It is a very big issue, especially in countries where they are being manipulated for revenue.
Well, that's I think you've hit on a very important point, and it's giving a good example of some of the things I've been talking about, and the people often are voiceless, and I think a lot of people in Papua New Guinea, especially Manus Island, are being voiceless about having all that issue coming on. They have, and not only that, it's another form of colonization, colonialisation, that, whether it's mining companies coming in, promising gold or money or goods and things, or our government promising money and roads and maybe schools or something. But we are dumping a problem on your people, on your country, as we have with Nauru. It's just another, and the people of Manus Island have not been asked about it, have they?
They've been asked, but they also promised for money.
Yeah.
But the whole problem is about I will do cultures and I will faith and all these things interact together. It's not only. I mean, we are open to have this, but how we deal with this. This is really a complex issue.
The very, very traumatized people are coming too.
And people from Manus are also. The island is not that big. This rising sea level is also affecting the island. So it is all interconnected. All the problems are interconnected. If we just leave it as that, and if the bishops are not even in PNG, have not heard from the bishops themselves, probably are not there yet. On Monday I will go and here they are talking about. I have not heard from the bishops and all this, talking about these things, because it's a very big issue and also complex, because everything are interconnected, and we should be, living it as Christians, as we say ourselves to be, and we claim to be like Christ. We can talk about it. It will be only for the board and for this small group, whereas if everybody gets it into heart, it has to come from the above, and we should meet in the heart, the human person. This has to come from these two angles, not only as religious talking about it, or Christians, but this. The meeting place should be always the heart, as we say, and it is human terms, but it is to take effect in.
Thank you. Anyone else?
As you have said, you will not really feel it. You really see people suffering.
Yeah.
And as I am talking, like I see the fish dying in my eyes, and that's our livelihood. And then these pigs come and feeding for the fish, and then they also die. And then people who the only source of living is washing in the sea, have been told not to wash in the sea for a long time. They all this, and I am part of them. That's my place. And I went and I was also talking about it, and they were, who is this? I said, I am from this place, and probably I was in the seminary, and people don't know. And then there comes in this bribery thing, they want to tell you not to suck them out and give you some money, and why? And as you said, you have to be really true to yourself in order not to be manipulated by companies and people in government. Otherwise, it will be, they hope they will be stealing, and once money comes in, the boiling pot stops.
It becomes messy, doesn't it? All right, well, I might just move on. Does anyone else have a question or a comment to make? one of the, as I said before, you know, I'm unashamedly political in my, and it's not talking about party politics, I'm talking about action, transformation, changing our world, you know. And I think, you know, and I think that's what Jesus was all about too. It wasn't trying to get people to heaven. It was about their relationships with one another, especially those who are most vulnerable in the community. And the church, I think, in its better moments, you know, is constantly urging us to participate in the public conversation about building right relationships. That's what, you know, that's what we mean by in the scripture, in the gospel, you know, right relationships, peace, justice in our communities. And it can never be a private affair. You know, it's I think it's an abuse, just between me and Jesus or something like that. And so we can't. And so religion, you know, we have these people, as I was called, people tell people to stay out of, you know, keep religion out of politics or stay out of politics or something. But I think it's just that religion has no place in the public forum. But even John Paul II, Pope John Paul II said we must reject the temptation to offer a privatised and individualist spirituality which ill accords with the demands of charity. He calls us to the task of shaping history. Shaping history. And it's you know, and I think the old, old Sacred Heart devotion is very much an individualist kind of a thing. You know, it's probably a lot of, I don't remember a lot of it, but it was very individualist, private, personal, and I think it's where the spiritual of the heart is something that takes us into the world, and it's about, you know, the task of changing the world and shaping history. And sometimes, I've already alluded to that, and sometimes, you know, when I said that the people that we expect to speak out don't, and the ones that do, the ones that we don't expect to, you know, and we have that passion for humanity often outside the church at times, a lot of the time. You know, I've mentioned the past examples like people like Stephen Lewis, who was an Under Secretary General of the United Nations at one stage. He was the Special Envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa, and he started a foundation that's very, very, very vocal on women's rights in Africa and also the support of people with HIV/AIDS. And he often, you know, when you hear him speaking, he seems to speak with rage and anger, but it's real passion, real compassion, you know. And there was some of my colleagues when they were in Guatemala a couple of years ago, they met up with a Guatemalan bishop, and the bishop said to them, when you feel enraged, when you feel angry or passionate deep in your guts, don't block it out, he said, because that's the voice of God speaking through you. You know? And it takes us back to the prophets again. You know, the prophets were railing against injustice, and they were speaking on behalf. This is God's heart, God's passion for humanity. You know, God, you know, that God's sharing in the humanity and the pain of others. Okay. We'll just skip the next PowerPoint. Peter Henriot, who's a Jesuit social analyst, says that for many people, where I stand on an issue depends on where I sit. I'd like to always add to something there. I say it's all very true. Where I stand on an issue depends on where I sit, but also who I sit with. You know, it's in other words, it's the person that I choose to connect with. It's an intentional thing. And so the prophets and Jesus insisted that worship and prayer that ignores the oppressed and the disadvantaged is a shame in God's eyes. You know, that if we ignore people's plight, then we can have no place with God, according to Matthew 25. You know, we have the resources in our world and the expertise to eliminate hunger entirely from our planet. When the Pope was in Brazil just recently, we didn't hear too much about what he did in the slums in Rio de Janeiro, but he saw a little bit, not that much. But the thing is, what I was thinking about is that it would take so little to change that. You know, to get rid of those slums. You know, just a couple of percent of, you know, the money transfers around the world, you know, the tax on that would eliminate the slums in the world. Just think about this country, Australia. We've got 23 million people and we spend $68 billion a year on military spending. Now, I don't know how many noughts are in billions, but I'll try to work that out. But if putting 23 million into 68 billion, you work out how much is spent per person in this country. And yet, it would take a fraction of that, to provide housing, education, better health care for Indigenous people and so on, maybe even better health care for the aged and so on. Let alone foreign aid. So we have the resources, it's about sharing. So we have a serious moral obligation, but there is a silence, and there's an unwillingness oftentimes in our situation. Silence means walking past a situation on our street, or a canteen, or office, or neighbourhood. Just recently, I had a little experience. I was going to visit a friend in hospital, and I think Phil's already heard the story, but it made a powerful impact on me. Like, you often see people in the street begging for money and so on. We'd often walk past them, and there was a story. My head's going somewhere else, but these two ministers walking down the road and busy going on their way to a meeting, and this woman asked for money, and they just bowed around and kept walking. And she ran after them and said to them, "What? You won't even look me in the eye?" This sort of thing, and that sort of shamed one of them. But my experience recently was I was in the city, and I was going to visit this friend in hospital, but I went to the bookshop in the city first, and I was past this woman, on her haunches outside the bank there in Hoarder Market at Castle Ray Street, and I tried to catch her eye, and she wasn't looking up, she was looking down. And she was only probably about early 30s probably. And so I walked up, and I sort of, when I come back, I'm going to sort of ask her to see what's on the note. She had this note, but had her head down like this. And so when I came back, she was still there, and so I came closer to her, and I was just about to say to her, "Can I read your note?" And she said, "Can I?" And she beat me, and she said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "Is there something wrong with me?" And I says, "I don't know." And she said, "Look, I've asked people, at the time, I asked one woman where she got a beautiful dress or a coat from or something like that, just make contact with her, and they wouldn't talk to me, And she started crying, And she said, "There's a man across the street begging for money and people are stopping. But he's got a dog." So they were stopping for the dog, probably, But the thing is, and I was going to give her some money, she didn't want it, but I gave some money anyway, but the thing was, I asked her a name, And the funny thing is, you can't forget a person once you know their name. She's not just a street person or woman on the street. I found out she'd been living on the street only for a few nights. She was a victim of domestic abuse and only had money for one night in a shelter, and she had no more money. But the thing is, her name's Leanne, and you can't forget it. So once you make those sorts of contacts, and maybe listen to a little story, there's a connection that's being made, and you find out something about someone, and hopefully it makes some difference, to them that, someone gives a damn too. But there is silence, in our world. We need to ask ourselves always, what is it that prevents us from engaging with these issues? What are the silences in our schools, or our parishes, or our communities? So we're morally complicit by our silences. And there is a stunning silence over many of the great questions of our time. Are we visibly engaged in debates over the great issues that are presented to us, such as international development, debt cancellation for impoverished countries, distribution of wealth and opportunities, whether overseas or in Australia, questions of ecology and abuse of the environment, also questions of war and peace. Catherine of Siena, St. Catherine of Siena in the 14th century said, "Speak the truth in a million voices, it's the silence that kills." And it was almost that sort of quote that was used during the HIV/AIDS or the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and the 90s, you know? Silence equals death. It's the silence that kills, says Catherine of Siena. And so why is it that this silence does move across our planet the way it does? Why is it growing even as we learn more and more of the issues that concern us? Why do we fail to raise our voices on behalf of things that trouble us and then regret that we didn't do it? Why do we resent or ridicule or dismiss those few people who do speak up? Is it because we don't know how to talk to each other anymore? Is it, there's more explanation here. Is it because we're overwhelmed by the amount of suffering in our world? Is it that people feel more powerless now than any other time in recent history? Is it that we're afraid of what we might lose if we speak out? And that was debate often the case with schools. Catholic schools don't speak out against the government too often. Or charities can't speak out because you might lose funding. What we will lose if we speak up. Is it that we've convinced ourselves that what's happening, goes back to the start of my talk actually, what's happening elsewhere doesn't affect us? No, I'm not connected with it. It's not part of me. There's that well-known, there's a story we might read later on. It's called The Mousetrap. I thought I started to talk with it, but I thought I'd leave it to the end. But it's about how we are connected with one another. There's that little quote by Pastor Martin Niemöller in 1945. It says, "First they came for the communists, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. And then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up for me." We can apply that quote to trade unionists, we can apply it to communists, or we can apply it to Muslims, we can apply it to all kinds of people, but somehow that we are all bound up together. So we need to ask ourselves, do we consciously notice when we're silent, or when we choose to be silent? Because silence is not the absence of action, but another form of action. It's a negative action. And Edmund Burke once said that the only thing necessary, what are quoted by Martin Luther King often, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. I just want to go into a little bit, and I've already touched on it also, is the whole idea that compassionate engagement in our world includes listening. I've mentioned had that quote by Father Hartnett and also by Mark Peel, because it's in the listening, I believe, also that we find healing, we find reconciliation. The whole sexual abuse thing in the church has oftentimes been exacerbated by the fact that people wouldn't listen, wouldn't take it seriously. And as bad as it was, and it needs a redress, but it started with just the fact that people wouldn't listen, take it seriously. We all have a story to tell, and everybody wants to tell their story in order to connect. And the failure to listen is like a failure to touch those wounds. In that gospel story again, it creates fragmentation, causes gaps between us. It's the root of a lot of suffering. And so it's the listening, the reaching out that creates relationship. And and I've found so often that once you know someone's story, you can't have that person. You can say things about Muslims, you can say things about asylum seekers, you can say things about gay people, you can say things. But once you know them as an individual, you know their story, they're no longer got that label, are they? I think it's a very important point for us to remember all the time. And so we all can play a part in that healing that needs to occur everywhere. Any questions? About 10 minutes. I've still got a few pages, but I'm happy to give you a copy or leave you a copy with Phil. One of the things is, I have a quote here by Margaret Mead, and it's important in terms of peace and justice work, and is that never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. It's always been, I think it's the important thing to remember. You know, the change has always come from the underbelly, from the grassroots. And it's, you know, it starts with 1 or 2 or 3 people. And that's where we find our hope too. Talking about, people say, you know, how do you keep up your hope, or how do you keep up your positive attitude to so many things that are bad things that are happening in our world? But the bad things are there in front of us. But you know, if you're engaged in some way, you'll find out also there are lots of people doing good things, and that's where the hope is. You know, and I've some of these examples, and I was even telling someone this morning, someone at the gym actually, this doctor, you know, the nuns that I know in their 80s that still go down to the Villawood Detention Centre, you know, to visit people, to let them know, because it's so important for people to visit the detention centre. So the guards know that these people have people contacts outside, so they can't be abused, you know. And also, not only that, but also these people know that someone cares about them. You know? I found that also when I was at Christmas Island a couple of years ago. You know, the people were thirsting for visitors, people from outside, you know, to know that they weren't forgotten, that they still remembered. And this is what we, you know, I think of the danger, people being moved to places like Nauru and Manus Island, where, you know, and Christmas Island's another one too, of course. You know, they don't get many visitors out there. You know, they do at Villawood, you know, because there are people in the community who care. But there are lots of people who care, and that's where we find our hope, because that's where the lights are. And you know, so, you know, our experience might be very negative, but to act positively is the source of hope. It's choosing what I call choosing hope over experience. As an example of someone who'd been married many times, you know, and kept getting married again. He said, "Well, don't you kind of sort of realise that this might not work?" And he said, "Well, hope this one will work." You know, choosing hope over bad experiences. But it's not something to laugh at. But anyway, it's just making that sort of point. And you know, the hope is not so much in terms of optimism, and it's not about success either. You know, to have hope doesn't mean that what we do, that our enterprise will be successful. You know? Whatever we do, oftentimes, has been being part of a group, being part of a process. Václav Havel, who was the former Czech president, also a poet and playwright in his own right, and he says that he talks about the insecurity and this fact, you know, the not knowing, and he says hope is a dimension of the soul, an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. And he goes on to say, it's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. It's the certainty that something makes sense, irrespective or regardless of how it turns out. And Thomas Merton, a Cistercian monk, also says, do not depend on the hope of results. You may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless and even achieve no result at all, if not perhaps results opposite to what you expect. As you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. And you gradually struggle less and less for the idea and more for specific people. And in the end, it's the reality of the personal relationship that saves everything. There's a wonderful story in Victor Hugo, it's in Les Miserables, Les Miserables. You know the story of this man who's been released from prison, and he's given hospitality by the bishop, and he spends a night or two or three with the bishop, and then he runs off and steals these candlesticks. You know the story? And then the police come and bring him back, and the bishop says, "Oh, you forgot to take the other things that you're supposed to take. I gave you these other things." He actually covered for this guy, and what happens was this guy is freed, but the bishop does not know how his life ended up. He would have no idea. He did what was right, or he felt was of value at the time. He would not know how this man ended up. We know the story, but the thing is, he did it because he could end up stealing more and more, or it could have changed his life. And that's the do it for the value in itself, because it's right. This is the truth of the moment. I think I might leave it there. Is that right? There's copies here. I copied that. You can make copies of it. Thank you.
Claude, thank you very, very much on behalf of the people who are here. And I think that you would probably agree with me when I say that Claude is a prophet amongst us. You speak of prophets and you speak of the wisdom of prophets, but what you bring to us is the wisdom of the prophets. And you never cease but to challenge me. I never feel comfortable or settled after I've heard you talk, but I always feel inspired and challenged. And that, I think, only comes from a life that's lived in two ways. And one, firstly, a life deeply committed to a vision of God. A person cannot speak as you do without knowing God. But also a person who's not just prepared to know God for himself, to take that, as Tony said this morning, to take that culture of God out into the world and demand that people hear.
It's Tony's fault. He was my teacher.
Was he? Well, I'd say
Tony. You taught me all I know
Tony,
about liberation theology.
you taught well, Tony. But thank you again, Claude, very, very much. And on behalf of those of us who are here, a small gift.
Thank you.